Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Livingston, and I am the Bitcoin Wizard. I want to go over this news that came out at the tail end of last week, right before the holidays, because this was incredibly bullish news for Bitcoin. This is not normal bullish news either. This is not the usual line about the institutions coming. This is the moments that Wall Street has quietly admitted that Bitcoin is no longer a guest. It has moved into the building, it has seized an office, and it has rewrote the risk manual while the legacy system was asleep at its desk. If you guys weren't paying attention last week, the Nasdaq elevated Bitcoin into the same market structure used for the biggest, most systemic assets on Earth. This is the plumbing that is reserved for the stuff that cannot be allowed to fail. You do not get this treatment unless the system has decided you are part of its survival strategy. The Ibit options expansion is not some technical footnote, kids. It is the regulators and the exchanges announcing that Bitcoin is now running on the exact same rails used by the mega caps that dictate global capital flows. You know the names: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, SPY, QQQ. Bitcoin has been placed in their category without asking for permission. This is the moment the traditional finance system basically said, fine, we give up. Bitcoin is too big to ignore, too liquid to starve, too demanded to suppress. Integrate it or get steamrolled by it. This is massive news for Bitcoin, and I'm going to tell you why. But first, I want to thank Horizon for sponsoring this video. Horizon helps you take your home equity, and you can take that home equity, your rotting, disgusting crack house, and they help you take that and buy Bitcoin with it. It's incredible. I have $100,000 in home equity in my house. I can take that with no debt, no monthly payments, no term limits, no forced liquidation. I can literally take my home equity and buy the dip in Bitcoin. It's glorious. They will help you every step of the way. It's extremely easy. Click on the link in the video description below, and I'll talk more about Horizon at the end of the video. Now, you got to remember, kids, once Bitcoin is locked inside the institutional liquidity regime, there is no exit because every model begins to reference it, every hedging pipeline touches it, every portfolio construction framework absorbs it, and these systems, they don't reverse themselves. They scale, they grow, they expand, and they compound. This shift locks Bitcoin into every single corner of the capital markets, not because anyone loves Bitcoin, not because they think Satoshi wrote sacred scripture. They do it because the machine requires it. They do it because the flows require it. They do it because the global risk engine now functions more efficiently than without it. And anybody who is anybody understands that this is how assets become permanent. This is how assets become mandatory. This is how assets transition from being debated on the internet to being welded into the center of the global financial architecture. The era of optional Bitcoin allocation is now over. The era of forced institutional integration of the asset has begun. If you think that the last bull run was insane, wait until you watch what happens when every major allocator on Earth is dragged into Bitcoin exposure because the system literally cannot operate correctly without it. This is the beginning of Bitcoin's final form. This is structural. This is irreversible. This is the moments that the system has quietly surrendered. All right, let's talk about the 1 million contract limit because this is the moment where the mask has fully slipped. Nasdaq did not wake up one morning and say, you know what would be cute? Giving Bitcoin an options limit 40 times bigger than before. They did it because institutional demand has already blown through every single ceiling that they've tried to put on it. People need to understand what it means when exchanges expand derivatives permissions. Because this isn't some branding exercise. This is not a marketing stunt. This is what exchanges do when the market makers are yelling at them behind closed doors because they cannot build proper inventory models at 25,000 contracts, which was the previous limit. The real players, they need more size, they need more depth, they need the rails expanded so they can actually run their strategies without tripping the circuit breakers every 5 seconds. When an exchange lifts limits like this, it is only because they have run the numbers and then they have realized that they will get obliterated by order flow if they do not scale the pipes. This is what we call a demand problem, not a supply problem. The institutions have already voted with their money, and the Nasdaq is scrambling to keep up. Now, not only is Ibit the most successful ETF launch in history, you have to understand that this move pushes Bitcoin into the same derivative surface area as the most liquid, systemically important ETFs on the entire planet. You do not get that level of permissioning unless you are viewed as a deep, serious, and mission-critical asset to the market. There is a reason why the tiny speculative assets do not get their million contract ceilings, because they are irrelevant, because nobody needs that size. But this is the point. Bitcoin is not irrelevant anymore. It has crossed that line into systemic significance. And this is just another step of the infrastructure treating Bitcoin as an asset that way. The market is treating it that way. The regulators are treating it that way. This is what happens when an asset graduates from curiosity to requirement. So it's really fun to see this happen, because Bitcoin is now being classified with the assets that the system cannot afford to ignore, the ones that the risk engines integrate by force, the ones that the institutional hedging complex needs access to at scale. This is how the capital markets promote something into the big leagues. Remember, they do it with their order flow, liquidity thresholds, and position limit upgrades. This is Bitcoin stepping into that arena where only the mega caps live. Once you enter into that category, you do not go back. The market structure does not shrink these limits. It only expands the limits, which means that Bitcoin is being positioned for a future where institutional exposure becomes a structural necessity rather than a choice. And people are still arguing about ETFs on social media while the actual financial system is quietly turning Bitcoin into the foundational asset for derivatives, hedging, and long-term liquidity management. This is real. This is material. This is the most bullish thing that has happened since the creation of Bitcoin itself, arguably. And this is the part nobody in traditional finance ever wants to admit, because they have lost the game. Institutions do not size anything with spot exposure. Spot positions in Bitcoin, they are often for the tourists. Remember, large pools of capital, they live inside of a world that is ruled by delta, gamma, vega, correlation matrices, risk limits, volatility targets, etc. If you cannot plug into those systems, you do not exist. And Bitcoin is becoming compatible with all of those systems. This is the moment that it crosses from outsider asset to full participant inside of the institutional hedging engine. And you're going to see that the risk models will recalibrate. Bitcoin is being fed into the same frameworks that manage allocations for sovereign funds, pensions, endowments, multi-strategy funds out there. Those systems, they operate at a scale that is measured in trillions of dollars. And once Bitcoin is inside their assumptions, it gets exposure by default. And you have to remember that the hedging pipelines are being rewired as well. The market makers and the macro funds, they need derivatives that actually work. They need to hedge term structure. They need to run dispersion trades. They need to balance options books without tripping thresholds. And Bitcoin is now going to give them enough liquidity and derivatives depth to do exactly that. The moments that this becomes possible, that's when the flow begins. You have to understand that structured flows are where this becomes permanently bullish for Bitcoin as an asset. These engines, these scale with liquidity. They scale with AUM, assets under management. They scale with systemic rules that trigger buys whether the manager is bullish or not. There is no emotion in these systems. There is only math, there is thresholds, and there is continuous rebalancing. So when Bitcoin enters all of those engines, the allocations, they will expand automatically as the assets under management expand. The exposure will compound over time because the inputs that determine the weighting signal that Bitcoin satisfies the requirements for inclusion. Once those boxes are checked, the machines do the rest. And this is how Bitcoin transitions from discretionary exposure to structural exposure. The flows into Bitcoin have already started. The systems that run global capital markets are integrating Bitcoin without asking anybody for permission. This is why this development matters, because it changes the baseline from optional involvement in Bitcoin to systemic involvement in Bitcoin. And this is the part of the story that keeps risk managers awake at night, because Bitcoin's supply curve moves in one direction forever. It shrinks, it compresses, it reduces the amount of float that the markets can actually access. Meanwhile, the institutional derivatives universe is built on a growth mandate. That's correct. Derivatives demand scales with participation. It scales with AUM, it scales with the number of strategies that rely on deep hedging tools. Those two curves, they're now meeting inside of regulated markets. One side, though, the Bitcoin side, that cannot expand. The other side, though, is demand to expand as long as the money exists. And that interaction between the two sides is going to produce pressure that does not resolve, it accumulates. You have to understand that market structure upgrades accelerate this every single time that the exchanges, they increase their position limits or expand settlement options. The number of channels that are available for expressing Bitcoin exposure, they multiply. And once those channels exist, the institutions fill them. The float of Bitcoin has to absorb the impact, and the float is shrinking every cycle. And we all know that the halving cycle obviously intensifies this imbalance. The pace of new issuance slows automatically. The number of long horizon holders increases because the institutions prefer assets that can't be diluted. The self-custody removes supply from circulation, and corporate treasury accumulation removes even more. The net effect of this is a structural mismatch between a supply base that declines and a demand engine that scales. That mismatch produces a liquidity squeeze with no natural release valve. It doesn't produce sudden spikes, it produces a long-term upward grind driven by structural scarcity inside of regulated markets with a persistent bid. And what's amazing is that this is coinciding with everybody saying that the traditional 4-year cycles for Bitcoin are dead. We are witnessing Bitcoin behaving differently from every single legacy asset. Finance has tried to integrate traditional assets. Remember, they rely on elastic supply responses, but Bitcoin removes that possibility entirely. The institutional system must expand exposure to an asset that does not expand its supply. And this collision is the beginning of a multi-decade upward pressure on price that is not narrative driven necessarily, and it's not driven by hype. It is a mechanical fact that is produced by the way that the derivatives market interacts with an asset that is totally finite. Capital markets assign privilege to assets that behave consistently under stress. They reward assets with predictable issuance, predictable liquidity, predictable settlement, etc. Anything that fails one of those criteria gets pushed to the margins. But the reality is that Bitcoin passes all three with complete precision, which is why the system is beginning to promote it from an investment to a collateral instrument. I talk a lot about this on the channel, but long duration collateral status is the first upgrade. We are in the infancy of institutions wanting a base asset that will not change its issuance schedule because some committee panicked. Bitcoin obviously delivers that with absolute consistency, cycle over cycle. And when you have a multi-decade allocation mandate, stability in the monetary schedule is worth more than any dividend or coupon. And tail risk protection is the second upgrade. Bitcoin's correlation profile, it behaves independently of the traditional system. During the stress events that are out there, the institutions need exposures that do not follow the same failures as equities, credit, or sovereign bonds. Bitcoin provides that break in correlation. Once the risk desks see this persist across cycles, they're going to treat it as portfolio insurance, whether they like Bitcoin or not. And this mispricing of risk, it will persist from some time. I believe that we are in a multi-decade process of the world being capitalized under Bitcoin, but I do believe that it is happening right now. It is demonstrable and it is incredibly bullish. Settlement grade status is the third upgrade because the legacy markets, we all know that they settle slowly, they fail very frequently, and they require multiple layers of trust. Bitcoin, though, obviously settles conclusively within minutes, and that reliability makes it a strong candidate for collateral that reduces all of counterparty dispute risk. So you think when the regulators look for ways to reduce settlement risk, this feature obviously becomes extremely attractive because nothing can compete with it. And the final upgrade is macro volatility absorption. As Bitcoin gains recognition as a reserve quality asset, asset, it will begin to capture the global uncertainty premium. The institutions allocate to assets that absorb macro shocks rather than amplify them. And Bitcoin's behavior during the geopolitical stress out there, the liquidity crunches, the monetary regime shifts, they will position it as an anchor exposure rather than a speculative one. And this is the reality. We have seen Bitcoin survive every single black swan event that has ever happened. In fact, it's been the best performing asset of the last 16 years through all kinds of regimes. And there is no other asset that delivers all four of these traits at once, not one in the entire world. Institutions are discovering that Bitcoin gives them a long-term store of value, systemic risk protection, settlement integrity, and macro hedging capability in one single instrument. When they adopt it as collateral, it is going to force a reconfiguration of the entire credit system, which is only hundreds of trillions of dollars of capital that will be flowing into Bitcoin. Not a big deal at all. Guys, we are living through the phase where Bitcoin is transitioning from being accumulated to being depended on. Can't you see it? It is beautiful. Once the system uses it for collateral, stability, settlement, adoption is going to become a requirement. Bitcoin is crossing into that role right now, and the market is adjusting faster than most people actually realize. And now we reach the part of the story where Bitcoin stops being an asset and starts becoming something called infrastructure. Nasdaq's reclassification has pushed Bitcoin into the same pipelines that handle the largest financial flows on the entire planet. These are the systems that do not care about ideology, they care about liquidity, execution quality, and frictionless hedging. The first consequence is classification. Once Bitcoin sits beside the megacap flow routes, the market treats it as a core component of global liquidity. That's not going to be some symbolic gesture. It is functional recognition that Bitcoin clears enough volume and depth to stand beside assets that move world markets. And then you're going to see the systemic integration, the hedgers, the model-driven allocators out there, the structured product desks. They're going to rebalance constantly, including Bitcoin. They're not going to ask whether Bitcoin deserves inclusion. Their models are going to detect the depth, liquidity, characteristics, and correlation properties. If the data meets their thresholds, the exposure will just enter the system kind of automatically. And once these systems start using Bitcoin as a balancing asset, they become unable to function efficiently without it at all. Removal of Bitcoin would disrupt hedging symmetry and raise operational risk. And the final consequence is structural buying. As these global markets are going to grow, the systemic strategies, they are going to scale their exposures proportionally. Automatic buy pressure is what I'm talking about for any asset integrated into these pipelines, and Bitcoin is going to become a beneficiary of this mechanical expansion. The demand is going to increase as the assets under management increase. And the buying never fully stops because the models never fully stop. This is the moment where Bitcoin as an asset becomes a buyer of last resort beneficiary, not because some central bank out there supports this, because I'm sure they don't, not because a committee has endorsed it. The buy pressure literally emerges from the structure of the market itself, and Bitcoin is entering the set of assets that require the continuous flows purely because the financial system requires them for stability. Bitcoin is gaining a permanent source of demand that grows with the size of the world economy. Once you reach this point in Bitcoin's market structure evolution, the debate ends entirely. Institutions allocate based on standards, liquidity standards, custody standards, derivative standards, regulatory standards, etc. And every single one of these categories is starting to be satisfied. Think of the sovereign wealth funds that are going to look for deep liquidity. Think for the pensions that are going to look for compliant custody. Think for the endowments that look for robust derivative products. Think of the banks that look for regulatory clarity. Bitcoin is delivering all of these. And these pools of capital, they don't move because of enthusiasm on Twitter. They move because their policy mandates require exposure. Once an asset meets every operational threshold, and Bitcoin now satisfies the entire checklist. This is where the shift becomes irreversible. Every barrier that previously prevented institutional adoption has been totally dismantled. The last obstacle was market structure maturity, and that obstacle is gone. Bitcoin is now positioned within the global financial system as an asset that institutions hold, hedge, custody, clear, and justify in any regulatory audit. This is the point where the capital markets really have no remaining argument for excluding Bitcoin. The system has already said yes to the asset. Integration is underway. This is hyper-Bitcoinization happening in real time. The flows will follow. Whether allocators love Bitcoin or hate it is now irrelevant. Exposure will increase because the frameworks demand it. My name is Adam Livingston. I am the Bitcoin Wizard. If you enjoy this content, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I am giga bullish on Bitcoin, and I spread the orange gospel to the masses every single day. Leave a comment to let me know what content you want to hear next, and help me spread the orange gospel to the masses with the algorithm. Commenting helps the algorithm. Thanks so much, everybody. I love you all. Have a terrific day. Do not party too hard. Class dismissed. Once again, a special thanks to Horizon for sponsoring this video. Most people don't realize this, but on average, 60% of American homeowners' net worth is locked up in their primary residence. And with home prices more inflated than ever, Americans now sit on a combined $35 trillion in home equity. Now there's a way to unlock that trapped capital and put it to work in Bitcoin. Horizon helps homeowners unlock a portion of their home equity to buy Bitcoin. It is not a loan, so there are no new monthly payments. You keep living in your home as usual, and then later when you sell, refinance, or choose to settle early, Horizon's provider takes an agreed share of your home's future value. That is the trade. Unlock cash now to stack Bitcoin by selling a slice of your home's future value while you continue living in it. What makes Horizon stand out is that there are no term limits and you keep 100% of the Bitcoin upside. The Bitcoin is fully yours to custody however you want, wherever you want, with no risk of forced liquidation. If you've been sitting on a pile of home equity and are eager to invest in Bitcoin, this may be the product for you. Visit joinhorizon.com to see if you qualify and get started. Their team of experts will work with you one-on-one from start to finish. Transform your dormant home equity into Bitcoin today with Horizon.